October 15, 1946. Wildflecken Displaced Persons Camp, American Zone, Bavaria. Canvas walls flap against wooden poles in the autumn wind. Inside a makeshift medical station, German women sit on wooden crates, their eyes fixed on nothing, speaking only when spoken to. The familiar ritual of bureaucratic processing continues as it has for months. Name, age, medical condition, political affiliation during the Reich. The same questions, the same mechanical responses. But then, a black airman enters carrying medical supplies and asks something that will shatter years of institutional silence. Something his commanding officers would later call ridiculous, inappropriate, against protocol. He looks at these women, former enemies, displaced persons, human beings reduced to case files, and asks the one question that changes everything. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do in war is treat people like people. In war, the wrong question usually gets you court-martialed, but sometimes it gets you the truth. The autumn of 1946 found Europe still bleeding from wounds that wouldn't heal with bandages or bureaucracy. Victory had been declared, borders redrawn, but the human debris of total war remained scattered across a continent that had forgotten how to be human. In the displaced persons camps of occupied Germany, former enemies became numbers in files, problems requiring administrative solutions, evidence of democracy's triumph over fascism. But democracy, it turned out, was more complicated than victory, especially when it came with its own contradictions, its own systems of exclusion that crossed oceans and followed armies into liberated territories. Black airmen who had fought fascism in the skies over Europe discovered that segregation traveled well, that Jim Crow laws extended their reach even into German prisoner-of-war camps, that the freedom they'd defended remained selectively distributed according to skin color and military hierarchy. The mathematics of post-war survival created its own cruel ironies. German women, stripped of everything except their capacity to endure, learned the particular silence that trauma requires for psychological protection. They spoke only when spoken to, answered only what was asked, volunteered nothing that might complicate their processing through systems designed for efficiency rather than empathy. Medical examinations became exercises in institutional dehumanization, where patients were conditions rather than people, where symptoms mattered more than stories, where healing was defined as the absence of complaint rather than the restoration of dignity. These women had learned to disappear inside themselves, to become invisible except when visibility served institutional needs, to transform themselves into the kind of manageable human cargo that military bureaucracy could process without moral complication. Their silence had become survival, their compliance a form of protection against systems that punished individual humanity as inefficient disruption of administrative order. Meanwhile, black medical personnel navigated the complex hierarchies of Jim Crow military culture, where they could treat German prisoners of war but were forbidden from providing medical care to white American soldiers. The absurdity was breathtaking in its systematic cruelty. Men who had risked their lives defending democracy found themselves eating in segregated mess halls, sleeping in separate quarters, excluded from officers' clubs, while treating former enemies with a professionalism their own army denied them. Technical Sergeant Marcus Williams understood this contradiction intimately. He had flown bombing missions over the same cities where these women once lived, had helped deliver the destruction that displaced them from their homes, and now found himself assigned to heal the human consequences of that destruction. Military protocol demanded that such treatment remain strictly medical, that personal interaction be minimized, that efficiency trump empathy in all professional relationships. Standard POW processing followed predetermined scripts designed to gather necessary information without encouraging human connection that might complicate the clean categories of victor and vanquished. But Williams had learned something during his service that military training couldn't teach and regulations couldn't prevent. He had learned that dignity was a choice, that respect was a decision individuals could make regardless of institutional policies, that humanity persisted even when official systems actively discouraged it. On that October afternoon, carrying routine medical supplies into the canvas-walled shelter, he made a choice that violated every principle of efficient military administration. Instead of asking about symptoms or political affiliations, instead of following the script that reduced human beings to administrative categories, he asked something ridiculous, something dangerous, something that treated these women as if they were people with stories rather than problems requiring solutions. He asked what they missed most about home. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across continents and through years of accumulated trauma. Bertha Müller, 34 years old from Hamburg, stared at this black airman who had asked her something no one had asked since liberation. What did she miss? The question implied that her feelings mattered, that her memories had value, that her experience deserved acknowledgement rather than processing. For months, she had spoken only when spoken to, had answered only what was required, had volunteered nothing that might complicate her status as displaced person awaiting resettlement. But Williams waited, not with the impatience of military efficiency, but with the patience of someone who understood that some questions require time to answer because they ask for truth rather than information. And then, slowly, Bertha began to speak about her grandmother's apple strudel, about Sunday afternoons in a kitchen that no longer existed, about the smell of cinnamon and the sound of her grandmother's voice explaining family recipes that had been passed down through generations of German women who never imagined their world could disappear in a single night of Allied bombing. As she spoke, tears came. The first tears she had allowed herself since liberation, the first expression of genuine emotion that seemed safe in this strange sanctuary created by a black airman's ridiculous question. The other women listened with the intensity of people hearing human voices for the first time in months. Clara Hoffmann, 19 years old, from Munich, found herself remembering dreams that seemed impossible now. Her plans to study medicine, interrupted by war and displacement, deferred by survival needs that left no room for personal ambition. But Williams listened, as if her dreams mattered, as if they were worth preserving despite the circumstances that made them seem absurd. He told her about his sister back in Alabama, who had become a nurse despite Jim Crow laws that limited opportunities for black women in medicine, who had fought her own battles against systems designed to exclude her from professions that needed her skills. The connection that developed between a black airman from Alabama and a German girl from Munich violated every boundary that military regulation and racial hierarchy attempted to maintain. Here was proof that human recognition could transcend the artificial categories that institutional hatred worked so hard to preserve, that shared dreams could create bridges across boundaries that politics insisted must remain unbridgeable. Dorothea Klein, 41 years old, from Berlin, had lost 3 sons in the war, boys who had died believing they were defending something worth dying for, young men whose deaths now seemed senseless in the cold light of defeat and displacement. She had carried this grief in silence, had learned that mourning was a luxury that displaced persons could not afford, that survival required focusing on immediate needs rather than overwhelming losses that served no practical purpose. But Williams listened to her stories about her sons, not as evidence of enemy casualties that proved Allied victory, but as a mother's testimony about individual human beings whose deaths diminished the world regardless of the uniform they wore. He spoke about friends shot down over Europe, young black airmen who had died fighting fascism while facing discrimination from the democracy they defended. Men whose deaths created the same kind of senseless grief that transcended national boundaries and political allegiances. In that moment, grief became a language that required no translation, a form of human experience that made enemies into people who understood what it meant to lose what could never be replaced. Elena Schmidt, 26 years old, from Dresden, described the night her city burned. The night when Allied bombers turned Baroque architecture into abstract sculpture, when cultural treasures accumulated over centuries disappeared in hours of systematic destruction designed to break civilian morale. She spoke about running through streets where familiar landmarks no longer existed, where neighborhoods became moonscapes, where survival required navigating by star maps because terrestrial references had been eliminated by forces too powerful for individual resistance. Williams listened without defensiveness, without the need to justify military necessity or strategic imperatives. He had flown missions over Germany, had perhaps contributed to the destruction she described, but he listened as if her trauma mattered more than military success, as if her experience deserved acknowledgement rather than justification. The moral complexity was staggering. Former enemies discovering that shared humanity was more important than conflicting loyalties, that individual suffering transcended the political categories that made such suffering seem necessary or inevitable. Frida Weber, 52 years old, from Cologne, revealed secrets that she had kept even from Allied interrogators. Stories about Jewish neighbors she had hidden until 1943, about the moral courage required to resist policies that her government insisted were necessary for national security. She had risked everything to maintain her humanity while living under a system designed to eliminate such humanity, had chosen individual conscience over collective compliance, had preserved dignity in circumstances that made dignity seem impossible or dangerous. Williams recognized something familiar in her story: the courage required to maintain personal integrity while living under institutional systems that discouraged such integrity, the moral strength needed to choose respect over safety when respect violated official policies. Here was evidence that some enemies had shown more courage than many allies, that heroism was more complex than uniform colors or national allegiances could contain, that the capacity for moral choice persisted even when political systems actively punished such choice. The ridiculousness of Williams's question became its transformative power. It had asked for truth rather than propaganda, for individual humanity rather than collective guilt, for recognition that these women were people with stories rather than problems requiring administrative solutions. Other medical personnel began to notice changes that violated every expectation about efficient POW processing. Women who had been silent for months were talking to each other, sharing stories, offering mutual support that transcended the isolated survival that displacement had imposed upon them. They began singing quietly while working, humming melodies that connected them to memories of home, to cultural traditions that survived physical destruction, to identities that remained intact despite political defeat and social displacement. The ridiculous question had given them permission to be human again. Not German or enemy or displaced person, but individuals whose experiences mattered, whose memories had value, whose dignity deserved protection rather than processing. Word spread through the camp with the speed that hope travels in desperate circumstances. Other black medical personnel, inspired by Williams' example, began adopting similar approaches, asking questions that treated patients as people, listening to stories that revealed humanity behind bureaucratic categories, creating spaces where healing involved more than medical treatment. White officers initially resisted these innovations, Fraternization regulations existed to prevent exactly this kind of human connection, to maintain clear boundaries between occupying forces and civilian populations, to preserve the emotional distance that efficient administration required. But medical outcomes began improving in ways that contradicted every assumption about proper military protocol. Patients who were treated as people rather than cases recovered faster, cooperated more willingly, created fewer disciplinary problems that complicated camp administration. The evidence was undeniable. Dignity was therapeutic, respect was medicine, recognition was more powerful than regulation in creating the conditions necessary for human healing. The moral irony was profound and disturbing. A segregated black airman was showing German POWs more humanity than the military system showed him. Williams ate in segregated mess halls where his own army maintained racial hierarchies that German prisoners never experienced, slept in quarters that his uniform earned but his skin color compromised, faced discrimination from fellow Americans while treating former enemies with dignity that institutional policies actively discouraged. The contradiction revealed something essential about the gap between democratic ideals and democratic practice, about the selective nature of freedom, even in armies fighting for universal human rights, about the way individual conscience could transcend institutional limitations when people chose humanity over hierarchy. Military efficiency had demanded silence, compliance, processing, the reduction of human complexity to manageable administrative categories that could be handled without moral complication. But Williams's ridiculous question had demanded something more dangerous: recognition that enemies were human beings with stories, losses, dreams, fears that transcended political allegiances and national boundaries. His question had implied that these women's experiences mattered, that their memories deserved acknowledgement, that their dignity required protection rather than just their physical survival. In a context where military protocol discouraged such recognition as inefficient sentimentality that complicated necessary administrative procedures, his question represented a form of resistance to the dehumanizing logic that made total war possible and post-war processing tolerable. Years later, when these women had been resettled in countries willing to accept refugees from the war that ended in 1945 but continued generating human displacement throughout the complex process of European reconstruction, they would remember many things about their liberation and processing through Allied systems. They would remember the relief of survival, the hope of eventual resettlement, the practical assistance that made new lives possible in foreign countries. But they would remember most clearly the moment when a black airman asked them what they missed about home. The first question that treated them as people with stories rather than problems requiring solutions. The first acknowledgement that their experiences mattered beyond their utility for military administration. The first recognition that dignity was something they deserved rather than something they might earn through proper compliance with institutional expectations. That question hadn't just broken months of institutional silence. It had restored something more fundamental than speech. It had restored the possibility of human recognition across boundaries that warfare had made seem unbridgeable, had demonstrated that dignity was a choice individuals could make, regardless of official policies that discouraged such choices, had proven that healing required more than medical treatment when trauma involved systematic dehumanization rather than just physical injury. Williams had understood intuitively what military training couldn't teach. That respect was medicine, that recognition was therapy, that asking the right ridiculous question could save more lives than following all the proper procedures. We return now to that canvas-walled room in the Wild Flecken Displaced Persons Camp, autumn 1946, where a black airman made the dangerous choice to ask what people missed about home rather than what symptoms required treatment. where former enemies became human beings through the simple act of being asked to remember what they had loved rather than what they had lost, where the most ridiculous question proved to be the most necessary one, because it asked for truth rather than compliance, for humanity rather than efficiency, for recognition that dignity was something people possessed rather than something systems could grant or withhold. Sometimes the wrong question saves more lives than all the right orders. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do in war is the most human thing you can do anywhere. If stories like this make you wonder about the moments when individual conscience transcends institutional pressure, when dignity chooses to persist despite systems designed to eliminate it, then perhaps there are other ridiculous questions worth asking, worth answering, worth remembering when the choice is between the comfort of proper procedure and the courage of improper humanity.